started like any other day in our quiet suburban home. I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and the sight of Sarah, my wife, smiling warmly at me from across the kitchen island. Her blonde hair caught the morning light, and for a moment, I felt like the luckiest man alive. 7 years of marriage hadn't dulled the way she made my heart skip a beat. That morning, she had news that would change our lives forever. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and nerves. I froze, my coffee mug halfway to my lips. Then, the joy hit me like a wave. We'd been trying for a baby for years, and finally, it was happening. I pulled her into a tight hug, promising her the world. In the days that followed, we celebrated. Friends and family congratulated us, and I started planning everything: nursery colors, baby names, even looking into schools. Sarah, however, seemed more reserved than usual. She brushed off my enthusiasm, saying she was tired or feeling overwhelmed. I chalked it up to hormones and let it slide. One evening, during a routine visit to the doctor, we got the estimated due date. March 15th, the doctor said, glancing at her chart. My heart sank, but I kept my face neutral. March 15th didn't make sense. I had been out of town for work during the entire month when conception would have occurred. The thought gnawed at me, but I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the doctor was wrong, or maybe I was overthinking things. Sarah wouldn't betray me. She couldn't. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. That night, lying in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. I forced a smile and nodded. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder the doubt became. March 15th, the date replayed in my head like a broken record. I wanted to believe it was a simple miscalculation. But when I started thinking back to that time, to the weeks leading up to the supposed conception, something felt off. I remembered being away in Chicago for a 2-week business trip. Sarah had seemed fine when I left, but in hindsight, she had been oddly distant when I returned. I chalked it up to stress or work at the time. Now, those small moments felt like cracks in the foundation of our marriage. At first, I told myself I was being ridiculous. Sarah had always been faithful, loving, and loyal, or so I thought. But there were little things that didn't add up. She had been spending more time on her phone lately, always quick to lock the screen when I walked into the room. When I casually asked who she was texting, she'd laugh and say, "Just the girls." One evening, I noticed her phone buzzing incessantly while she was in the shower. The name on the screen caught my attention: Logan. I didn't know a Logan, and Sarah had never mentioned anyone by that name. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen, debating whether to pick up the phone. But before I could decide, the buzzing stopped. That night, I tried to brush it off. "Who's Logan?" I asked as casually as I could over dinner. She didn't even flinch. "Oh, just a guy from work," she said, waving it off like it was nothing. "He's been helping me with a project." Her response was so nonchalant, so practiced, that it only deepened my unease. The next day, I started noticing other things, small, seemingly insignificant details. She had a new perfume that I didn't recognize, one that smelled expensive and unlike her usual taste. She'd been dressing up more for work, wearing outfits I hadn't seen before. Then there were the late nights. Sarah rarely worked late, but over the past few months, she'd started coming home later and later. "Deadlines," she'd say, her voice tinged with exhaustion. I wanted to believe her, but something about the way she avoided my eyes when she said it made my chest tighten. One night, unable to sleep, I sat in the living room scrolling through our calendar, trying to piece together the timeline. The more I analyzed it, the more obvious it became. Something didn't fit. Sarah had always been an open book, but now it felt like she was writing chapters one wasn't allowed to read. By the end of that week, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know the truth. But how do you accuse the person you love of something so devastating? I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Instead, I decided to dig deeper, hoping I was wrong. The doubt had become an obsession, and I knew it was only the beginning. The weight of doubt was unbearable. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The idea that Sarah might be hiding something gnawed at me every waking moment. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed proof one way or another. That Friday evening, Sarah told me she had another late meeting at work. "Don't wait up," she said, kissing me on the cheek. I nodded, forcing a smile as she walked out the door. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I sprang into action. First, her laptop. Sarah rarely used it, but it was still on the desk in our home office. I opened it and tried logging in. Locked. I stared at the screen, my frustration growing. She'd always been careful with her passwords, and I hadn't paid attention to them before. Next, her phone. I'd seen her type in her passcode dozens of times, and my mind raced to recall it. Came to me in a flash, her mother's birthday. I grabbed the phone from the nightstand and typed it in. The screen unlocked. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages. Most of them were harmless texts from friends, family, and coworkers. But then I found the thread with Logan. My chest tightened. The messages were casual at first, mostly work-related. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. There were jokes, inside references I didn't understand, and even a few late-night messages. One in particular made my blood run cold. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My heart pounded in my ears. I checked the timestamp. It was from 2 weeks ago, on a night Sarah had claimed to be working late. My hands gripped the phone tightly as I scrolled further, looking for more incriminating evidence. But before I could dig deeper, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I panicked, quickly locking the phone and placing it back on the nightstand. Sarah walked in moments later, looking as calm and collected as ever. "You're still up?" she asked, slipping off her heels. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to sound casual. My pulse was racing, but I forced myself to act normal. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that message. Who was Logan to her? A fling? A mistake? Or something more? I needed to find out. One afternoon, I called her office, pretending to be a potential client. "Hi, I'm trying to reach Logan," I said, keeping my voice steady. The receptionist hesitated for a moment. "Logan isn't in today," she replied. "Can I take a message?" That was the first red flag. Sarah had told me she was working with Logan that day. What was she really doing? The next step was obvious. I needed to meet Logan face to face. The need to meet Logan consumed me. I had to know what kind of person he was and what role he played in Sarah's life. After some online sleuthing, I found him on LinkedIn. A clean-cut guy with a charming smile, the kind of face you'd see on an office poster promoting teamwork. He worked in marketing just like Sarah, and even had a few pictures from their company events. One picture stood out. It was from a recent team retreat. Logan and Sarah stood side by side, laughing, their bodies slightly angled toward each other in a way that felt intimate. My chest tightened. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them sitting behind a screen. The next day, I decided to pay Logan a visit. I waited until Sarah left for work, then called in sick. After a quick drive to their office building, I parked across the street, watching the flow of people going in and out. Around lunchtime, I saw him, a tall guy with dark hair and a confident stride. "Logan." I followed him to a nearby cafe, my heart pounding with each step. He ordered his coffee and found a table near the window. Taking a deep breath, I walked over and sat across from him. "Logan?" I asked. He looked up, confused. "Yeah. Do I know you?" "I'm Michael," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Sarah's husband." His expression faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, offering a polite smile. "Oh, right. Sarah's mentioned you. Nice to meet you." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Has she mentioned you to me?" Because I found some messages on her phone. Messages that don't exactly sound like they're about work. Logan's smile faded. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding my gaze. "Look, man, I don't know what you're implying, but Sarah and I are just co-workers. That's it." I didn't believe him. His tone was too defensive, his body language too nervous. Then explain this, I said, pulling up the screenshot I'd taken of the incriminating text. His face went pale. Where did you get that? He stammered. It doesn't matter. What matters is the truth. Are you sleeping with my wife? Logan sighed, running a hand through his hair. No, I'm not, he said finally. But I think you should ask her about Jason. Jason? I repeated, stunned. Logan nodded, his expression grim. He's the one you should be worried about, not me. I sat there in silence, trying to process what he'd just said. Another name, another layer of betrayal. Who was Jason, and what did he have to do with Sarah? Before I could ask more, Logan stood up, grabbing his coffee. Look, I don't want any trouble. Just talk to Sarah. She owes you an explanation. With that, he walked out, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. I sat there for a long time, staring blankly at the table. Logan's words echoed in my mind. Jason is the one you should be worried about. The truth was slipping further out of reach, and I knew I couldn't stop now. I had to find Jason. Jason. The name lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Who was he? How did he fit into all of this? And why hadn't Sarah mentioned him before? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I truly knew about my wife's life outside of our home. That night, I couldn't bring myself to face Sarah. Her laughter during dinner felt like a cruel joke. Her casual conversation a mask hiding a secret life. Every word she spoke sounded hollow, every glance a potential lie. But I played along, pretending everything was fine. After she fell asleep, I returned to the laptop. This time, I was determined to crack her password. I tried every combination I could think of. Birthdays, anniversaries, favorite places. Nothing worked. Frustration bubbled over, and I slammed the desk in anger. Then it hit me. The name of our first pet, a golden retriever she adored as a child. I typed it in, and the screen unlocked. Relief washed over me, quickly replaced by a sense of dread. Her desktop was pristine, almost too clean. No suspicious files, no incriminating folders. But as I searched deeper, I found something. An encrypted folder labeled Work. It seemed innocuous at first, but why encrypt a work folder? Using a decryption tool I downloaded earlier, I broke into the folder. Inside were dozens of emails, but they weren't work-related. They were between Sarah and someone named Jason Brooks. The messages were intimate, far beyond anything I'd seen with Logan. I can't stop thinking about you. Last night was everything I hoped it would be. When will you tell him the truth? My hands trembled as I scrolled through email after email, each one cutting deeper than the last. It wasn't just an affair. It was a relationship, one that had been going on for months. And worse, they'd been planning to meet again soon. But it wasn't just the romantic exchanges that caught my attention. There were mentions of money, strange cryptic references to the plan, and hints at something far darker. One email stood out. We need to be careful. If Michael finds out, it could ruin everything. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Ruin what? What had they been planning? The next morning, Sarah left for work as usual, kissing me goodbye like nothing had changed. I stayed behind, calling in sick again. I couldn't focus on anything else. I searched Jason Brooks online, desperate for answers. What I found shocked me. Jason wasn't just some random man. He had a history, a criminal record that included fraud, embezzlement, and extortion. He wasn't just dangerous, he was calculated, manipulative, and Sarah was caught in his web. By the time she came home that evening, I had all the pieces, but none of the answers I needed. I knew I had to confront her, but I wasn't sure how. One thing was clear. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about something much bigger, and I had a sinking feeling it was far from over. The moment Sarah walked through the door that evening, I felt the air in the house shift. She greeted me with her usual smile, but it felt forced, almost brittle. I watched her closely as she slipped off her heels and hung her coat, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Tonight, I wasn't going to hold back. "Hey, Michael," she said casually. "How was your day?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood there, watching her, trying to find a trace of guilt in her expression. She finally looked up, her brow furrowing. "Everything okay? Who's Jason?" I asked, my voice sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. Her body stiffened. It was subtle, just a fraction of a second, but I caught it. Her eyes darted away, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Don't lie to me, Sarah," I said, my voice rising. "I know about the emails. I know about the messages. Who is he? And what are you two planning?" Her face turned pale, and for a moment, I thought she might deny everything. But instead, she sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling as she covered her face. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then tell me what it is," I demanded, stepping closer. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for months. And not just about him, about everything." She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "Jason and it was a mistake. I swear, Michael. But I ended it." "Don't insult me," I snapped. "I've seen the emails. I know you're still talking to him. And Logan, was he just a distraction? A decoy?" Her eyes widened in shock. "Logan? What are you talking about? There's nothing between me and Logan." I could feel my control slipping. "Then explain the messages. Explain why Jason said I could ruin everything if I found out. What's going on, Sarah?" She hesitated, her lips trembling as she struggled to find the right words. Finally, she spoke. "Jason and we were involved in something. Something stupid, something I regret. It wasn't just an affair. He convinced me to help him with a plan to get money." "What kind of plan?" I asked, my voice low, cold. Her silence was deafening. Then she said it. "Insurance fraud." My stomach turned. "What?" She took a shaky breath. "Jason wanted me to fake a burglary at the house. He said it would be easy, that no one would get hurt. But then he wanted more. He started talking about you, about how we could fake an accident, and..." I slammed my hand on the table, cutting her off. "Stop," I growled. "Just stop." The room spun as her words sank in. She wasn't just unfaithful. She'd been conspiring with a criminal, plotting against me. The woman I'd trusted, the woman I'd loved, had betrayed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. "I swear, Michael," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to hurt you. I called it off. That's why Jason's angry. He won't leave me alone. Please, you have to believe me." I stared at her, my mind racing. Was she telling the truth? Or was this just another lie? Either way, one thing was clear. I couldn't trust her anymore. "Pack a bag," I said finally, my voice cold and steady. "You're leaving tonight." She looked at me, stunned. "Michael, please." "Don't," I interrupted. "You've done enough." As she walked upstairs to pack, I sat in the silence of the living room, my mind a storm of anger, betrayal, and confusion. The woman I thought I knew was a stranger, and the life we'd built together was crumbling before my eyes. But I wasn't done. If Jason thought he could manipulate my wife, invade my life, and walk away unscathed, he was wrong. I was going to find him. The next morning, Sarah was gone. I watched her drive away with a single suitcase, her tear-streaked face disappearing in the rearview mirror. I didn't feel relief or closure, only a deep, simmering anger. Jason Brooks had torn my life apart, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I spent the entire day gathering information. I revisited the emails I'd found on Sarah's laptop, looking for any clue that could lead me to him. His address was listed in one of the earlier exchanges, an apartment in a rundown part of town. I wrote it down, my resolve hardening. That evening, I drove to the address, parking a few blocks away to avoid being seen. The building was old, its brick facade weathered and covered in graffiti. I waited in my car, watching the entrance, my heart pounding with adrenaline. An hour passed before I saw him. Jason stepped out of the building, wearing a leather jacket and exuding the same smug confidence I'd seen in his mugshot. I followed him, keeping a safe distance as he walked to a nearby bar. Inside, the place was dimly lit and smelled of stale beer. Jason sat at the bar, ordering a drink. I took a seat in the corner, observing him. He was relaxed, chatting with the bartender, completely unaware of my presence. I waited until he finished his second drink before approaching him. "Jason Brooks?" I asked, standing behind him. He turned, surprised, before his expression shifted to cautious amusement. "Who's asking?" "Michael," I said, my voice low and steady. "Sarah's husband." Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a smirk. "Ah, so you're the famous Michael. I was wondering when you'd show up." My fists clenched at his arrogance, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We need to talk," I said, gesturing to a booth in the corner. Jason shrugged, grabbing his drink and following me. We sat across from each other, the tension between us palpable. "What do you want?" he asked, leaning back casually. "I want to know everything," I said. "What you've been planning with Sarah, what you've been threatening her with, and why the hell you thought you could mess with my life." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You really think Sarah's the victim here? She was in on it from the start, man. She wanted this as much as I did." "You're lying?" I snapped, my anger boiling over. "Am I?" he countered, his smirk widening. "You should have seen her, Michael. She was desperate for excitement, for money, for anything that wasn't you. I just gave her what she wanted." I slammed my hand on the table, drawing the attention of a few nearby patrons. "Enough," I growled. "Tell me what the plan was. Now." Jason's smirk faded, and his eyes narrowed. "It's over," he said, his tone darkening. "Sarah backed out, and you're still alive, so congratulations. But don't think this is the end. You messed up my plans, Michael. And I don't forget things like that." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to let him see my fear. "If you come near me or Sarah again, you'll regret it," I said, my voice firm. Jason laughed, standing up. "We'll see about that," he said before walking away, leaving me alone in the booth. As I sat there, the weight of his words settled over me. Jason wasn't done, and neither was I. Jason's parting words haunted me, but they also solidified my resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I contacted a private investigator. If Jason wanted to play games, I'd play smarter. Within days, the investigator uncovered Jason's recent activities. He had a history of targeting vulnerable people, conning them into his schemes, and leaving them to take the fall. He drained Sarah emotionally and financially, manipulating her until she was too deep to pull out. The most chilling revelation came from a series of wire transfers. Jason had been siphoning money from Sarah's personal accounts. She wasn't just his accomplice. She was his victim, too. Armed with this evidence, I confronted Sarah over the phone. "I know about the money, Sarah. Jason's been using you." Her voice broke as she cried, "I didn't know, Michael. He promised it was temporary, that we'd fix everything. I'm so sorry." Her apology felt empty, but I needed her help. "Give me everything you know about him. If we don't stop him, he'll ruin more lives." Reluctantly, she agreed. Together, we began to piece together Jason's network and plans. But I knew we were racing against time. With Sarah's help, we gathered everything we could about Jason's operations. His next big scam involved a massive insurance payout, something he was planning to stage using Sarah as a pawn once again. But this time, we weren't going to let him control the game. We set a trap. Sarah agreed to meet Jason at a secluded location, and I planned to have the police waiting in the wings. The plan was simple. Bait him with the promise of the next big score, then catch him red-handed. The day of the meeting, I could barely sit still. Every minute felt like an eternity. I waited in a car, watching from a distance, my heart pounding as Sarah drove to the meeting spot. She texted me once she arrived, "It's done. He's here." I signaled the police, and within minutes, they were in position. I watched as Jason approached, his confidence still evident, unaware of what was about to happen. Then it happened. Jason stepped forward, and before he could speak a word, the police swarmed in, arresting him on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and more. He tried to fight back, but it was over. The trap had worked. The news of Jason's arrest spread quickly. Sarah, still shaken from everything, was taken into custody for questioning. Though she wasn't arrested, it was clear that her involvement in his schemes would leave a stain on her record. It wasn't just the affair anymore. It was the lies, the manipulation, the deceit that had poisoned everything between us. I couldn't bring myself to forgive her. Not yet. The weight of everything she'd hidden from me, the betrayal, the danger she'd put us in, was too much. But I knew she needed help. Sarah wasn't evil. She was just broken. In the weeks that followed, I kept my distance, giving her space to process her mistakes. Meanwhile, I worked with a lawyer, preparing for what came next. Jason was facing a long list of charges, but it was far from over. He still had connections, people who would stop at nothing to protect him. I was no longer just fighting for my marriage. I was fighting for my life. The trial was a tense, grueling experience. Jason's defense tried everything to shift blame, but the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, financial records, and even Sarah's testimony were enough to seal his fate. Yet, through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, watching my back. Jason had connections, people who operated in the shadows. It wasn't safe to assume he'd simply disappear behind bars. I couldn't afford to relax, not yet. Sarah, for her part, was doing everything she could to rebuild her life. She entered therapy, tried to make amends with me, but the trust was shattered. I couldn't forget how easily she had been manipulated, how her betrayal had taken so much from me. In the end, Jason was convicted, sentenced to a long prison term. But even with his downfall, I knew the scars would never fade. The man I had been before this all began, trusting, hopeful, happy, was gone. As for Sarah and me, we were left to rebuild, though I couldn't say what the future held. Maybe time would heal some wounds, maybe not. What I did know was that I couldn't change the past. I could only move forward, and that was terrifying in its own way. But the question lingered in my mind. Could I ever trust again? As the story comes to an end, I want you to ask yourself, how far would you go to protect everything you've worked for? When trust is shattered, what's left to rebuild? Leave a comment with your thoughts below, and if you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There are more stories to come, and who knows what twists and turns they'll bring. Stay with me and let's figure this out together.